It is a new year, and I cannot think of a better way to kick things off on this channel than to talk about some Switch accessories. There are a few that came out over the past few months that I just have not had the chance to cover just yet, along with a couple other ones that I have done dedicated videos on that I just want to include once again in these roundups to really touch on some of my favorite stuff that's come out recently. And I want to start by talking about the SplitPad Pro. The SplitPad Pro has been a favorite of mine ever since it released back in 2019, but one of the problems that it has run into is the fact that while it is great to have larger Joy-Cons to use on the system itself, a lot of people were wishing there was a way to also be able to use it with their docked system. Now, this is a problem that has been answered by some unlicensed companies. For instance, Binbok, which we've covered a little bit, they offer larger Joy-Cons that can also wirelessly connect to the Switch, but being an officially licensed option by Nintendo, the Hori SplitPad has only been able to work while directly connected to the system itself. And their solution to that is the SplitPad Pro attachment. This was officially released in the West last year. For a while, you could only buy it in a bundle with the SplitPad Pro, which is fine if you need to get a SplitPad Pro in the first place, but if you already own one and you just wanted a way to connect it to your Switch in docked mode, not really the most helpful option. It does look like you can buy these individually on their own now if you're doing it directly through Hori. I'm not seeing options pop up on other retailers just yet. And the way this works is really simple. You just slot the SplitPad on each side of the attachment, plug it into your Switch, and you now have a wired Switch Pro controller. And I'll admit, this is a bit of a wonky looking controller. It's very wide in overall dimensions because it's almost like the two halves of the SplitPad Pro make a regular size controller, but now there's this whole bridge part just added into the middle. But ultimately, it is a comfortable experience. I mean, if you like the feel of the SplitPad Pro in handheld mode, that's going to translate over into this wired controller setup really well. And you're still going to have access to special features that the SplitPad Pro offers, like using the remappable back buttons. And one additional function you are going to get as well is that there is a microphone jack at the bottom of the attachment. So if you want to use a wired headset, that's all going to work together. To be perfectly honest, if I just have my choice of any controllers out there, I definitely prefer a more traditional wireless controller setup than using this SplitPad Pro attachment. Where I think this shines though is that if you are generally a person who really plays in handheld the vast majority of the time, you've already invested in a SplitPad Pro, and you just want something to be able to use with your console in dock mode occasion, you haven't invested in a wireless controller yet, this is a really great way to open up that functionality and not have to throw down on a whole new, more expensive wireless controller. And for that matter, if you don't have a SplitPad Pro yet, maybe you just got your first Switch and you're looking for accessories to grab, if your focus is handheld and you just need something for dock to get it done, I think this is a good, affordable fit. Now, speaking of more traditional controllers and playing the Switch on the go, an alternative take to making your Switch really comfortable in handheld mode is a controller grip. There's a couple of these that have existed in the past, but one that I've really liked is the Fixture S1. I've talked about this one a couple times in the past, but one of the big problems it ran into is that when the Switch OLED released and was a little wider, you couldn't use it with it because it wouldn't fit the grip anymore. Thankfully, late last year, they released the Fixture S2, an updated design for the model that addresses a couple problems the original one had, and now comes in an option that fits the Switch OLED. Now, if you haven't seen me talk about this thing before, the setup is really simple. You take your Switch OLED tablet and slot it into the S2, and then there's a controller grip attachment that wraps around a Nintendo Switch Pro controller. And using the hinge, you can place the tablet above the controller in a way to where you're kind of hiding your controller, but it balances out the weight in a way that's actually really comfortable and gives you a convenient, easy, on-the-go way to use a Switch Pro controller in handheld mode. Now, one of the issues that this grip ran into in the past is that it does have a bit of a bad habit of lightly marking up the stuff you use. In the case of the controller, depending on how you wrap it around, you do run the risk of scratching the body of the controller a little bit. And in the case of the Switch tablet, sometimes it would leave this kind of residue that would mark up the back. The Switch tablet part has been addressed with this new model. They changed the kind of rubber pads that are on the back and keep the Switch in place, and it doesn't leave the same kind of noticeable marks. The Pro controller, though, you do still run into the issue of potentially lightly scratching it if you're not careful while putting it on. I think my big suggestion here is that if this is something that looks cool, do you want to use it? Maybe don't necessarily use it with a limited edition controller or one that you really care about keeping as pristine as possible. On that note, this grip is specifically designed to work with the official Nintendo Switch Pro controller. However, I have tried it with a couple other wireless options, and there are some that will lightly fit. One I'm going to talk about in a little bit is the Bidoo Ultimate, and that is another controller that it will fit around, though it's not going to have the same degree of snugness. Basically, the main thing here is I think if you plan on just using this grip to play a game sitting down different places, on a couch, laying in bed, whatever, you're able to use this with other controllers fine. But if you actually like the idea of, walking around and moving a lot and playing at the same time, I would probably stick with the official option so that it's an actual really strong, tight fit and not something that's going to jiggle around a little bit. Next, I want to take a little bit of a break from the more controller-oriented accessory options and talk about the Genki Covert mini dock. This is a dock that I covered recently, is the second one that Genki has released, and it's basically a ultra-portable, super small dock that you can use with the Nintendo Nintendo Switch or Switch OLED. They previously released a larger version of this that was just called the regular Covert dock, and the Mini is a even smaller version of this that sacrifices some features, adds on some others, and is sold at a lower price point that in my mind is actually more worth it. Again, compared to the regular Covert dock, there are some things you are losing. The biggest one is the additional USB-A port. The Mini only has a USB-C port to plug into the Switch and then an HDMI port to plug into your TV. The additional USB-A port on the regular Covert dock Mini could be used for a lot of different things like the Ethernet adapter. You could use it for a controller adapter if you had a wired controller you liked using. The Mini loses that, so you're going to lose access to all those kind of things. But generally speaking, at least for my use case with this, where it's meant to be a travel dock solution, I'm not looking to use a lot of additional accessories. I just want an easy, low-profile way to plug into displays, which the Mini is really nice for. Another downside worth mentioning is that the Mini does provide less power than the original Covert dock, so it doesn't charge the Switch as quickly, and if you end up using it with other devices like the Steam Deck, which is another really handy use for it, it's not going to keep up with how much power drain the Steam Deck has, so while it will make it play longer, it's not going to necessarily keep the system indefinitely running depending on what kind of game you're playing and how much it drains the battery. That said, one other upside this dock has, aside from its smaller size, is that unlike the regular Covert dock, this one actually supports up to 4K resolution, though worth noting it only does it at 30 frames. Not something that really matters much for the Switch itself since the Switch is capped at 1080, but again, if you want to use this with other devices like a Steam Deck, the ability to support up to 4K is really cool. Now back to controllers, because there's actually been a few different interesting releases for this past year. I want to talk about the Brawler 64. Now I actually touched on this controller a couple months back as part of a roundup video, and then not too long after I did that roundup video, they released a new version of the Brawler 64, which has some pretty important updates that I think make it really interesting to grab if you have not grabbed the original version of this controller. Basically, the original Brawler 64 was a newly designed N64 controller that they made N64 options for and Switch options for. And part of the pitch for the Switch one was, oh, if they ever do Nintendo Switch Online, you can use this for that. And when Nintendo Switch Online did come out with N64 games, the Brawler 64 actually didn't end up working out great because of the way that Nintendo handled the button mapping. Now, the company behind the Brawler 64, Retrofighters, did address this issue with a firmware update where you could basically do a button combination that would turn the controller into NSO mode, where now the buttons would match up with what the Switch thought the buttons should be for N64. But it was kind of an esoteric thing, and if you owned it and never even thought to do the firmware update, it's a feature you're never going to get access to. Thus, this new version of the Brawler 64, which comes with a few updated features. One, it adds a couple buttons that the previous one didn't offer. For instance, the original Brawler 64 didn't have a minus button because it was really trying to match the layout of the N64 version of the controller, which needs less buttons than a Switch does. And so there were ways to do the minus button, again, doing button combos, but this controller just gets rid of that entirely and instead favors having all the buttons that you need to fully operate a Switch, which is honestly, I think, a called for change. The other thing it does is that it adds an actual switch for flipping between regular Pro Controller mode and NSO mode. So when you want to use this for N64 games on Nintendo Switch Online, you just flip that switch to swap over and you're good to go, which is a lot simpler than the button combination the last model required. Also, while it's not the main selling point of why this one's worth picking up, one other upgrade this new one has is revised rumble motors compared to the previous models of Brawler controllers. Basically, while the regular Brawler 64 controller worked fine for NSO stuff after a firmware update, this newer model really addresses it and just makes the overall thing way simpler and just a much better fit for the Switch in general. If you waited on picking up a Brawler 64 controller before, awesome, because this one's much better to go for. If you like N64 games on your Switch, this is a really great pickup because honestly, I don't love the way regular Switch controllers map to a lot of the N64 inputs, and so having a controller that actually has all those extra buttons, including mimicking the C button setups, is really nice. Last but not least, I want to touch on what was my favorite Nintendo Switch accessory of last year, the 8BitDo Ultimate Controller. Despite not being an officially licensed controller manufacturer, 8BitDo has been one of my favorite controller makers for the Switch. They were doing a lot more kind of retro-inspired stuff early on, but then they started turning more towards trying to make their own approach on a Pro controller, and the Ultimate is a really good take on this. It's comfortable, good-feeling buttons and sticks, a great D-pad, which is one of their main kind of hallmarks, but really what makes this one interesting to me is the suite of Pro controller features and the charge stand. This is the most expensive controller they've made. It matches in price to the official Switch Pro controller, whereas before a lot of them would be cheaper at about $50, but this new Ultimate one comes with a charge stand, which A, makes it really easy to charge the system, but the charge stand also acts as a way of housing and using the USB transmitter, so if you don't want to use the Bluetooth connection, but instead do a dedicated 2.4 gigahertz connection, it's going to do that through the charge stand, which you're already plugging into the system dock anyways, which is a really cool two-in-one solution that I love. It's kind of gimmicky, but I love it. That aside, other Pro features worth touching on real quick. The controller does have a pair of remappable back buttons. There is an iOS and Android app you can use for a bunch of customization things like remapping all of the buttons, adjusting trigger sensitivity, stick sensitivity, rumble intensity, and even being able to program macros if you want. One of its biggest selling points though is that alongside the King Kong Pro 2, which also released last year, this is part of a new generation of Switch Pro controllers, which make use of a different stick technology that does not develop the same drift problem that mainline Switch controllers currently have, which, considering how relatively often this happens for some people, is some really nice peace of mind to not have to deal with. Now, I don't want to say this is necessarily like the be-all end-all controller that does everything, because there are some problems that it does have compared to an official Nintendo Switch Pro controller. The biggest features you're losing out on: NFC reader, which isn't the biggest deal. You can always grab a Joy-Con if you need to scan an amiibo. The bigger thing though is HD rumble. Official Switch controllers have a very specific form of vibration that a lot of games are designed around and can give some really interesting feedback that third-party controllers don't have. There is a rumble feature, it's just not going to really work the way that the official ones are intended to. With that in mind, as things stand right now, the 8BitDo Ultimate is my favorite Switch Pro controller. Personally, I do normally play stuff in handheld mode the majority of the time, but when I do play docked, this is the controller I'm using. So there's a bunch of more recent Switch accessories that I've really enjoyed using. Again, some of these I have talked about a little more in depth on before, so if you want to see some more in-depth comparisons or how some of these features work, you can check those videos out. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. Everything I talked about the video is linked down below in the description if you want to grab any of it, and I'll see you guys later.